Elf on the Shelf is a popular children's Christmas brand that started as a storybook packaged with a decorative doll before blossoming into peripheral merchandise. The brand is controversial for a whole medley of reasons that are not the focus of this video. We don't care about any of that. This December, I posted a poll on Tumblr asking readers what they think the plural form of Elf on the Shelf is. Full disclosure, this poll was fairly tongue-in-cheek, as some of the options surely illustrate, and in addition, I actually scheduled it a few months in advance, so suffice it to say that I wasn't thinking all that much of it at the time, and indeed the results fell in pretty much exactly the way one would expect. But as with all posts, there's always the hideous matter of the notes. This is the manner of quandary that pretty plainly boils down to personal preference, but a solid handful of people spoke as though their answers were objectively correct, and what's more, these statements are pretty universally based on fairly extreme unspoken assumptions that are nowhere near as uncontestable as they're being framed. Case in point, a couple people wrote in on their ballots to nominate elves on shelves as the true path. I've encountered this before. I don't know where the apparent notion that plural nouns are categorically incompatible with definite articles originates, but it is a pretty bold and assailable stance, as is the adjunct assumption being made, which is either that grammatical prescriptions should have the authority to delete entire words from brand names, or that Elf on the Shelf is, I guess, not a brand name and rather just like an observation. To be extra super clear, I have no issue with any of the commenters. I am not someone who enjoys picking fights, and we are going to play nice. But the notes have brought to my attention that this scenario presents a good and fun opportunity to illustrate the kind of decision making that this type of question necessarily provokes. My intent was to append this illustration onto the post in a reblog, either as text or as like a flowchart, but it became quickly apparent that I couldn't do it without being messy as all hell, so here we are. I present to you Indigo's official Holly Jolly treatise on how to determine the plural form of Elf on the Shelf. This most festive of Enchiridia will be framed as a decision tree. You can imagine hanging decorations from its branches. I also realized much too late in this process that the actual brand name is The Elf on the Shelf. It's not that big of a deal because I feel like in day-to-day speech somebody would just like point at one of the dolls and say that's an elf on the shelf, so it doesn't really impede anything that we're going to be saying here. The first decision we make is something we have to lock in. Are you considering the plural of elf to be elves or elves? And before anyone tries to come for me, both are precedented. Part of the issue here is that elf is not even close to an ironclad concept. Some people will tell you that elves versus elves are actually the correct plural forms for two distinct types of thing. The attestation that Tolkien created the spelling elves where previously it had always been elves appears to be an urban legend. The long and short of it is that elves demonstrably predates him. Dwarves is the one where he said that he felt it was an incorrect pluralization but was using it for his book. This fact and more are documented in a 2021 article published by Merriam-Webster, which attests that elves, as well as shelves incidentally, and the rest of the V for F pluralizing, formed out of simple habit on the part of English speakers who just cannot resist the allure of a juicy voiced fricative. Point is, pick the one you think sounds nicer, or the one you think is more justifiable or whatever, and lock it in. The second question on the docket is the most important of them all by a pretty sizable margin, because it's the one that's going to cleave the trunk of our decision tree into thirds. What is Elf on the Shelf, like grammatically, as a construction, as an English part of speech? I present three options to you. Is it a proper noun? Is it an improper multi-word noun? Or is it neither of these things, i.e. an unremarkable string of words with no special considerations attached? First branch. By proper noun, I of course mean that Elf on the Shelf is in the same category as the Seventh Continent, Kate Blanchett, the United Arab Emirates, and Wendy's. Pluralizing proper nouns is nothing crazy. I might ask, do you know an Elizabeth? And you might reply, I know two Elizabeths. Certain brand names make it a bit dicey though. I could easily say there are two Burger Kings on this block, but what if the tavern I wanted to drown my sorrows in was Starbucks? Would I say two Starbuckses, or two Starbucks, or both, or neither? What about McDonald's, with all of the implicit violence loaded in that demure little apostrophe? McDonald's is horrific, outright horrific. I'm terrified right now. I'm afraid for my life. An official publication is likely to sidestep the issue by saying McDonald's locations and Starbucks locations. It would also be likely to say Burger King locations rather than Burger Kings. How about the deployment of clothing brand names as synecdoches for items of the brand? You could show someone your bag and say, this is a Versace bitch. But what if there's two bags on one arm? Hell, make it 3. Is that 3 Versace's or 3 Versace? Or would you at this point just start structuring your sentence differently to avoid having to say that? In other words, would you evasively avoid actually declaring your stance on the issue like some kind of politician? And it gets all the worse by the addition of like regular English words that have irregular plurals. Take the brand Canada Goose. If you're talking about multiple of their locations or multiple synecdoche items, does that become Canada Geese? I'm wearing 10 Canada Geese right now on this runway. Let's get to the point here. What I'm trying to illustrate is that even within the bounds of proper noun, this is not a solved problem. I suppose the first question of this branch should be, does proper noun status impart exceptions to the commonly accepted grammatical structures that surround improper multi-word nouns? And if you answered no, then redirect yourself to the multi-word noun section. Next question, does proper noun and or brand name status mean that the plural form should be the same as the singular? In which case the answer is elf on the shelf. Now let's get to a meaty question. When we are grammatically transmuting a proper noun into plural, do we need to identify the head for the sake of declining it? Or do we treat the whole multi-word phrase as one big Frankenstein-y head? I've been editing and I realized that not everybody is going to know what a head is, so here's my super rapid explanation. If you're not familiar with head nouns in English, here's how I'd like you to think about it. When you have a noun phrase, that is a phrase comprising multiple words, many of which may not be nouns in and of themselves, but which function collectively as a noun in a wider semantic context, the head is the single noun at the heart of that phrase, the one which the other words are orbiting and modifying. Here's an example of an improper noun phrase: the silly silly story of a wet little rock from France. This is several words covering several parts of speech, but it is a noun phrase. You can treat it collectively as a noun. It can be the subject of a clause or the object or even the complement if you want to get nasty. And the word story is the head. Every word before it is a modifying adjective and every word after it is hanging off by a preposition. Story is the true noun, the real noun at the heart of this noun phrase. What that means in terms of practicality is that if you wanted to modify the phrase, say by making it plural, the head is what you would target. In this example, the word story would become stories. Rock and France are both nouns in themselves, but we don't pluralize them because they're not the head. The head is also what we look to for the sake of subject-verb agreement. Here's an example sentence: an elf that frequents several shelves is observing. In the noun phrase, which includes a relative clause, elf is the head word, and elf is singular, so our present progressive verb is conjugated as is observing rather than are observing. It does not matter that the noun phrase ends with a plural noun because the head is singular. The elf is observing. It is not the shelves that are observing. So now you know what the head is. Returning to the question, for example, if for some god-awful reason we needed to pluralize the land before time, and we can't sidestep this, we can't say the land before time movies or anything evasive like that, we have to answer it or our bomb collar will go off, would we say the land before times? And if we are going the Frankenstein route, then do we treat it as sticking an S on the end of the whole beast, i.e. elf on the shelves and we're done, or are we treating it as pluralizing the last word of the phrase, i.e. elf on the shelves? Rewinding to the previous question, does pluralizing a multi-word proper noun mean pluralizing its final word or pluralizing its head? We can actually proceed down both of these paths at once. The former case suggests that we pluralize only shelf, while the latter case suggests that we pluralize only elf. But either way, our next question immediately comes up and it applies to both of these. Does proper noun status impart immunity to irregular pluralizations? In other words, is it indeed Canada Gooses? If you answer yes to this, that suggests that we are saying shelves rather than shelves and elves rather than elves, regardless of what our initial pick in the elves versus elves debate was, because we are prioritizing the integrity of the sequence of characters, or in the elf case, the subsequence of characters, over established declension convention. But anyway, answering each of these questions gives us our final answers for this branch. Last word plus irregular immunity equals elf on the shelf. Last word without irregular immunity equals elf on the shelves. Head plus irregular immunity equals elves on the shelf. And head without irregular immunity equals elves on the shelf or elves on the shelf, depending on what your initial pick was. I suppose it could be argued at a bit of a stretch that disregarding the irregular plural for the sake of the brand name extends the power of corporate branding into the realm of the lexical. unofficial. I don't feel especially bothered by that, in all honesty, and I am not going to be the voice in the pulpit on that point, even though I am literally on record as saying that officially designated names for things should have less authority over attendant discourses. I don't think this is the same as that. That was about the terms that we as interlocutors regard ourselves as being permitted to use in a proper capacity, and this is about the idea of making a deliberate orthographic decision to convey a tidbit on both de dicto and de re levels, i.e. that the signified is a brand name product created in a corporate context, and that the signifier we're choosing to deploy is the one ordained by the brand. We can get all of this across just by tweaking a couple of letters. Isn't language fun? Regardless, we have our answers. Second branch. By multi-word noun, I of course mean that Elf on the Shelf is in the same category as Will-o'-the-Wisp, Lily of the Valley, and various other phrases in trench coats that can be summed up as noun, preposition, article, noun. In other words, what if Elf on the Shelf is not a proper noun and it's not something with any particular grammatical ordainment imparted by its brand name status or any other officiality, but it is still a noun unto itself, i.e. that Elf on the Shelf is as distinct from an elf that happens to be on a shelf as a Lily of the Valley would be from a lily that just happens to be from a valley. Multi-word nouns typically have agreed upon pluralizations, like the plural of Lily of the Valley is generally known to be Lilies of the Valley. You're still taking the head of the phrase. Will-o'-the-wisp is a bit dicier. Apparently the accepted plural is will-o'-the-wisps, which to me inflects the whole thing in a new dimension. Like, will of the wisp is one individual wisp's willpower, but will of the wisps implies collectivism, a shared mission. The wisps are organizing. But I looked it up, and allegedly, according to etymonline.com, the O is short not for of, but for with, like will with the wisp. And it's also will like the name, like that's William and he has his wisp with him. Is anybody else like getting chills right now? Other sources corroborate this too. Wikipedia corroborates the will part, but maintains that it is indeed of. Some of Wikipedia's citations for this fact are a little iffy, I won't lie, but the Oxford Dictionary cites several historical examples of will with the wisp, so I don't think we can deny it. What is this video about again? The point is that multi-word nouns in English do typically ask you to pluralize the head. See also modes of production, pieces of furniture, islets of Langerhans, but that's not exclusive. So we end up back at a minute variant of one of the questions from the first branch. Taking Elf on the Shelf as an improper noun, is it more correct to pluralize the head word as in Lilies of the Valley and most other similar examples, or the final word as in Will-o'-the-wisps? Of course, Will-o'-the-wisps is like with rather than of, and will is an ostensibly proper noun or whatever. That does kind of imply that there are maybe more factors behind that against the grain pluralization than it initially seemed, but we don't care about that. This video is not about the wisps. It is not about fairy lights either, or orbs for that matter. I don't care what happens in the Sinister Swamp. Okay, I do care, just not right now. The point is that we are now at the same question as before. Pluralize the first word or the last word, and this time we are not living in fear of proper nouns, so if you pick pluralizing the first word, apply elfs or elves per your own discretion. Some might be wondering why in neither this branch nor the last have I offered an option to pluralize both elf and shelf. I'm aware of very few English multi-word nouns, proper or improper, for which it's broadly considered correct to pluralize all constituent nouns. Like, the plural of Hillary Clinton is not Hillary's Clintons. Hillary's, but whatever. The only instances I can think of are ones where something about the phrase itself implies that the numbering of each component noun is 1-to-1. For example, genies in bottles, or big fish in small ponds. Fish is plural here, I swear to God. And two things about that. One, even these examples are kind of iffy to call multi-word nouns in the same way that the aforementioned Lily of the Valley is, rather than just being run-of-the-mill noun phrases. And two, nothing about Elf on the Shelf implies that kind of one-to-one relationship. One elf per shelf and one shelf per elf? That's fucking dystopian. If you can come up with some reason that it would make sense, then go crazy. Otherwise, you can satiate your craving for a plurality of pluralities in the third branch. By neither, I mean, is Elf on the Shelf neither a proper noun nor a multi-word noun at all? Is it simply an utterly quotidian confluence of lexemes traipsing their way into a sentence? That is Elf on the Shelf simply a noun phrase that contains a prepositional phrase, or God forbid, a noun that doesn't include a preposition phrase. What if on the shelf is an adjunct? Spooky. As I've already mused in one of my innumerable tangents, this branch is a teetering cradle balanced atop the presumption that Elf on the Shelf is not a brand, nor is it any kind of precedented or documented phenomenon. An elf on the shelf is not a kind of thing, it's an observation. It's a descriptive phrase remarking on what you are observing. There is an elf on a shelf, and it could be anybody. It could be you. So you may be assuming that this branch therefore only volunteers a single conclusion, and if so, you couldn't be more wrong. First question. Are the elves in question all on the same shelf? If yes, the answer is elves or elves on the shelf. If the answer is no, they're on different shelves. Second question, are you speaking in a context in which it's appropriate to refer to these multiple shelves with a definite article? In other words, will the listener understand these shelves as specified? If no, elves or elves on shelves, and note also that the singular should really therefore have been elf on a shelf. If yes, third question, have you arbitrarily decided that plural nouns are incompatible with definite articles? If yes, elves or elves on shelves. If no, elves or elves on the shelves. Those are really the key questions of this branch. I could easily keep going ad nauseum. Like, for example, I could say, does the listener require clarification about the location of the shelf? If so, you might benefit from saying elves on that shelf over there. Or, is the shelf to be understood not as a literal shelf, but as a metaphysical space rhetorically exemplifying the abstract idea or state of being shelved? In the same sense, one might say something has gone to the trash heap without having a particular corporeal heap in mind. If so, it's elves on the shelf, and maybe capitalize shelf, and also the for good measure. Fuck it, let's live a little capitalize on too. As a sort of recap, let's invert our perspective and look backward from the end. I believe in math they call this checking your answer. Elves on the shelf is the plural form if elf on the shelf is a normal noun phrase describing multiple elves on a single shelf, or if it's a proper or improper multi-word noun where you pluralize the head word. Elves on the shelf is the plural form in all of the same scenarios if you have decided that elves is the correct plural and or that being a proper noun would exempt elf on the shelf from normal declension irregularity. Elf on the shelves is the plural form if elf on the shelf is a proper or improper multi-word noun where you pluralize the final word. Elf on the shelves is the plural form if elf on the shelf is a proper multi-word noun where you pluralize the final word and it's exempted from normal declension irregularity. Elves or elves on the shelves is the plural form if it's a noun phrase describing multiple elves on multiple shelves. Elves or elves on shelves is the plural form in the same scenarios, but if the shelves are undefined and or you are allergic to saying the. Elf on the shelf is the plural form if brand name status overrides the capacity to have a normal plural form. And elves on the shelves is the plural form if you're like evil. Here's the flowchart. So yeah, your answer to this question actually reveals a lot about your decision-making process. This was my breakdown of everything. I'm sure there are possibilities I have not considered, and I welcome you to share them. I have been considering elf on the shelf to refer to either an instance of the toy or an instance of the character depicted by the toy. Surely there are other modes of interpretation that could produce different decision trees. Please do not mistake any of this for an exercise in prescriptive grammar. This was an exercise in interpreting the gray areas of grammatical convention. There were also a pretty sizable number of commenters who took this as an opportunity to get in a dig at elf on the shelf. I don't consider this to be worthy of like anything more than an offhand mention, because the discourse that surrounds elf on the shelf is something that I just find really tedious, in all honesty. Like, wow, you really got one in on that fucking children's toy. What's next? You gonna drag Polly Pocket too? Last thing I'll say, I'm fully aware that there may be like an official plural ordained by the brand. I'm actively choosing not to look into it because there's no fun in that. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. You can feel free to check out my channel or my Tumblr at Indigo's Findings. I've had this channel through 4 Christmases now, and the fact that I've now made themed videos for 3 of them is not lost on me. I never intended to be someone who makes seasonal gimmick videos, and in truth, I still don't intend to be that person. I suppose it's simply a fact of life that when something occupies the entire world for like a solid 1/6 of all of time, it tends to be pretty easy to start forming opinions. Thanks again. Here are 5 bonus possibilities for your consideration. 1. What if elf on the shelf is an uncountable noun? Then it wouldn't have a plural form. We need a unit of measurement, such as grains of elf on the shelf. 2. What if it somehow turned out that on is the head of the phrase? Like if, for example, elf was an adjective and on was a noun, and I guess the shelf isn't a positive or something. Then the plural would be elf ons the shelf. 3, what if there is no shelf? Then the plural would just be elves, or possibly elves. 4, what if the Royal Shelf Elf Battalion pioneered a new system of enumeration whereby you pluralize a noun by repeating it n times, where n is the number of that noun, i.e. elf elf on the shelf, elf 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 on the shelf, elf 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 on the shelf shelf shelf, etc. And what if they forced everybody to adopt this system forever? Wouldn't that be fucked up? 5, what if it's simply an irregular plural, like, oh my god, I just realized, I know the incontrovertible correct answer. The plural of elf on the shelf is octopodes.